Hello, we will get started shortly. Thank you everybody for joining the webinar today. We will get started in just a moment. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. We will get started shortly. Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. You will be listening shortly to the local homelessness crisis and with the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce has been researching in the community. We will get started shortly as our hosts join us soon. Hello attendees, thank you so much for joining us today for our local homelessness crisis webinar. We will get started shortly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. We are going to wait a few minutes as people sign on here and we'll get started.
Hey, I've been trying to get a hold of you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are seeing a bunch of people jump on here, so we're going to give it a little bit of time. All right. Hey Heidi, if you're there, can you promote Russ from a attendee to a panelist?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, I see more participants coming in. Heidi, I assume you're letting folks in. Awesome. All right, we'll give it one more minute here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Are we up on social, Jen or Heidi?
Jen's working on it just real fast.
Okay, no problem. Tried to limit my caffeine intake this morning for you all, but I'm not sure I was successful. So might be a little energetic during this presentation. It's a topic that gets me fired up. Yeah, all of our attendees are muted, but we will have a chance for some questions towards the end, and excited to hear what you guys have to ask or say. I see some of our community partners on here who do a lot of work in this space, and I've spent a lot of time sitting down and talking to over the last month, so I'm glad you guys are here. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm waiting for a good to go from Jen or Heidi on the Facebook recording. If not, we can post it later.
Just a little technical difficulties, but we are almost there.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with our sponsor introductions, and then we should be up live by the time we make it through that. So hi everyone, welcome to this Committed to Community webinar. We have been doing this Committed to Community webinar series since the beginning of the pandemic last year. For those of you who haven't logged on to one of these before, last March, we as an organization, we're just taking in a whole lot of questions and having a lot of businesses coming to us concerned about the state of the pandemic, the state of the community. And we felt like getting these webinars out to the community in a way that is free and accessible to everyone, and a way that we could answer a lot of questions and bring experts to the conversation to talk about issues that were really important to business. Was a way that we could serve the community. And we were hosting these 3 times a week for the first several months of the pandemic. And we continued and decided this year that this webinar series was really valuable to our members, so we would continue to do that. We're so incredibly grateful that Oregon Community Credit Union has come on as our title sponsor for this webinar series. They share our passion and commitment to community, and we are very grateful for their support. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Russ Bernardo. Russ is the Chief Lending Officer for our sponsor, Oregon Community Credit Union. He's also on the board of the OCCU Foundation, which has quickly become a leader in philanthropy and invests in initiatives and organizations that enhance and accelerate the well-being of Oregonians. So Russ, I'm going to toss it to you for a minute to tell us a little bit about your organization.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Glad to be here. OCCU is a proud sponsor of the 2021 Committed to Community webinar series. I'm especially excited to be here today representing the OCCU Foundation, where our vision is to create a community where neighbors and neighborhoods thrive. We support programs and organizations that increase access to healthcare and improve community health. We partner with innovative and inspired thought leaders to make lasting impact in the areas of learning, living, and thriving. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about homelessness in our community. I know I'm very interested in hearing more about this body of work. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Brittany, to share with us what you've learned over the last few months. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Russ. Thanks everybody who's joined us today. We have participants logged on. The webinar is being recorded and we will post it to our website. We also have this posting live on Facebook right now, and we have a couple staff who are monitoring the Facebook chat. If you're in this webinar and you have a question that you want to pose, we'll have time at the end to answer those, but feel free to put those into the chat as they come to your head during the conversation. If you're on Facebook watching this, you're welcome to put questions into the chat there, and we'll make sure that they get pushed on over here to the Zoom meeting. So thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. This topic is one that is complex, but not overcomable, in my opinion. We have learned a lot over the last several months, and I think that we have pieces of what we believe is a path forward for our community that we're excited to share with you today. All right, Heidi, I am gonna need you to help me here. It says that I am not able to share my screen.
Oh, were you? Okay, yes, let me fix that real quickly.
Thank you. You can make me back host and then I should be able to do it.
Perfect.
All right, while she's getting that up there, we have, as an organization, really taken a deep dive into this conversation around homelessness over the last several months. We know, and many of you who are living in this community can see for yourselves that we have a homeless crisis on our hands, and we're very careful but intentional of using that word crisis, because I really do think that that's where we're at as a community. And we'll share some stats with you all this morning that I think are going to be eye-opening, but hopefully they're going to be informative and help you kind of ground yourself in what the current state of this issue is as a community. Heidi, are you switching me to host?
Yes, so sorry. Jen's the host and she needs to make you the co-host. We're working on it right now, sorry.
That's all right. You'd think after so many of these we'd get it down, but that's all right. So we have done a lot of research and we have been listening to our members, and what we have heard is that folks feel kind of hopeless. Either they don't know what's going on in this community around this space, they look around and they think nothing is going on, or they don't feel like what is happening is actually working. So we know that we have a situation on our hands that is critical for us to dive in and to try and help solve. So images like this, I know a lot of you have seen throughout the community, kind of exemplify the state of what current portions of our homeless crisis look like. And, these individuals are in crisis, and they are living in an environment that really is not, I think, suitable for anyone to be inhabiting. And ultimately, we want to make sure that we understand that our vision for what we're trying to accomplish here as a community is one that I believe is shared between homeless individuals, between our government and nonprofit partners, and the broader community. The first is our ultimate vision for the chamber and for the community is a thriving local community where businesses can succeed and individuals can live happy, healthy lives. And that really helps us, connect with a lot of organizations in this community who want that exact thing for this community as well. And when it comes to this issue, we're talking about a vision for a community where homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring. And we have as a community, I think, fallen into a place where we're managing this issue, and we need to make sure we're shifting to a place where we're actually finding solutions. So what is the issue? There is a growing number of individuals living on the streets in our community. Over 80% of our population of unhoused individuals are living in places that are not and should not be, they're not inhabitable for human beings, right? We're talking about streets, we're talking about living in medians, living on, someone's back stoop, and it's not something that we want for anybody in this community. We also have a growing amount of crime near some of these unsanctioned camps across the community. I want to make sure to emphasize that we absolutely understand and believe that not all homeless individuals are criminals, nor is the act of being homeless itself a crime, and it should not be criminalized. However, we do know, and we have very strong evidence that there is a growing amount of crime happening in and amongst the homeless population in some of these unsanctioned camping spaces across the community. Oftentimes our businesses, our community employees are victims of these crimes, but our homeless individuals are also victims of these crimes. And so I think it's something that we really can come together with our homeless population to try and address. So why did the chamber jump into this issue? Like I said, over the last year, we have just had this increasing amount of outreach from the business community, asking what's the chamber doing? What can we do? We're feeling incredibly hopeless about this, and we're kind of at our wits' end. We're losing money, we're losing staff, and we have compassion for the individuals on the street, and we want to be a part of the solution. Like I said, people are feeling hopeless. And I think that as a community, it's very easy to fall into this place where we're saying something needs to be done, but we're not making a specific ask. And I don't think that's worth much. I think that what we really need right now is to dive into actual solutions. So we're bringing things to the table instead of just telling someone else that they need to fix the problem. So that leads me to the chamber's role in this conversation. We really sat down to figure out what could the chamber do, what could the business community do, and how do we help bring those people together? And there's really 5 areas that we've been focused on. The first is researching the current state of the issue. Like I said, the issue is complex, but it's not one that we can't overcome. And to start, we needed to know what the current state of our situation was. So we're going to share a little bit more about that. The second is our role is to organize and convene businesses in this community. And we do that across all kinds of different issues. And there's no reason why we couldn't and shouldn't be doing it around this issue as well. The third is to communicate and educate the community. There is so much good happening in this space as well. And we have nonprofit service providers who are making incredible strides along, solving this issue. But unfortunately, they're resource strapped. Our community government partners are not in a place where there's an effective way to communicate this out to the broader community so we can start to bring hope back. The chamber, I think, can help in that role. The fourth is to innovate and collaborate with partners. One of our core values at the chamber is innovation, and we are not afraid to think outside the box and look how we can do things differently. That's what we're doing with this conversation. And we know that there's best practices and communities out there across the country that are dealing with this issue also. It is bad in Eugene, and it feels really bad in Eugene, but we are not alone. Communities all up and down the West Coast, and frankly across the entire country, are dealing with this issue as well. And so we've made an effort to reach out to communities across the country to try and understand things that they've been doing that work as well. And the last is to advocate for solutions. I think we can, push the issue and kind of be a loud voice, but we want to make sure we're being a loud voice for solutions and not just complaining, because really, I think we've all kind of identified the problem and we're past that. We really need to get to where we're going to solve it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these areas today, and then hope that we can provide you guys with more information that might spur some questions or ideas, frankly, that you have as well. So starting with research, when we decided 3 or 4 months ago to really dive into this issue in a deep way, I knew that what needed to be done in order for us to be effective in the conversation is for us to really understand it. And I have a personal pet peeve of being the person in the conversation that comes in late amongst all these partners that have been working on this issue for a while and not having done my own homework to figure out what we've already tried and what is currently working. And so that's what we did. We went out to the community. We've had over 125 one-on-one conversations or interviews with nonprofit service providers. We've spoken with nearly every executive director of a nonprofit that is working in and around this space across the community. We've spoken with local businesses, had sit downs, visited their companies, understood kind of the dynamic of the issue around their businesses. We've been working very closely and trying to understand from our government partners, the city and county, what it is they're doing, the barriers that they're facing as well. And we've also been talking to other communities, like I said, doing a ton of research to see what is happening in LA around this issue, what is happening on the East Coast around this issue. And we've learned a lot. 3 things that I asked in a lot of those questions: what does the data show about our community, and what information do you have that I need to know? What are the root causes of this issue, and what are the challenges keeping us from actually solving this? So we'll talk a little bit about what we learned. So we'll start with, what does the data show about this issue in our community? So I'm going to throw a bunch of stats at you, but it's information I think it's incredibly important. To start off this story, historically, the federal government is funding this issue at state and local jurisdictions. And with that funding, there's a responsibility for communities to report how many homeless individuals they have living in their community. And for a really long time, the way that that's been done is by what's called a point in time count. And this is where we've had one night a year where a bunch of volunteers go out into the community and count homeless individuals who are living on the streets. It's typically happening in the winter months. So as you can imagine, they're not finding everyone. There's a lot of people trying to find warmth and not sleeping out on the streets in places that are easy to count. And so that number has historically been severely undercounted, or undercounting our homeless population. A few years ago, our county started using a system that is now kind of more broadly being accepted across the country, and that's a homeless by name count. This count is far more accurate, although it still has its own shortcomings. But it essentially is creating a list of individuals in our community who have accessed services through our homeless service network and have indicated that they are homeless. And so we, in theory, as a county, have an actual list of homeless individuals, and we're able to count at a much more granular level who in our community is homeless and who's accessing services. In 2020, we had about 9,000 individuals who were at some point in time considered actively homeless in our county over the course of a year. In just May of 2021, we had 3,245 individuals who were homeless in Lane County. And I want to reemphasize that that number is probably still undercounting what's really happening in our community. And of those, 2,474 were in Eugene. Now, a lot of people want to take this conversation to a place that I think is fine to discuss, but I'm not sure it's exactly the most effective way to deal with this issue. And that's by saying, well, why are so many people coming to Eugene? Other people are shipping their homeless individuals here. We have too many resources and services here, and that's why this issue is what it is. The reality is, Eugene is the large metro community for our county, and we are, just by sheer population, going to have more resources. This issue is one all along the West Coast, and larger communities that have the hub of resources have higher populations of homeless individuals. Yes, there are definitely homeless individuals in our community who have come here from another community. And I think that we can have a conversation about what that looks like, why that is. But the reality is, we have 2,400 homeless individuals living in Eugene that we need to find a place for them to shelter safely. Doesn't matter where they're from at this point. If we can find a place for them to shelter safely and it's back in their home community, great, let's have that conversation. But I think a lot of times we get caught in this wheel of discussion about, well, where are these people from? And we sort of stop there. And I think we have to keep pushing forward. As a county, the numbers that we found in 2020 were that we had about 1,500 beds available across emergency, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and rapid reentry housing. So those different types of housing kind of represent a spectrum that ideally we're moving homeless individuals through. An emergency housing situation really is a shelter bed. Right now we have congregate shelters in that the Eugene Mission, St. Vincent de Paul has a site, out on Highway 99 called the Hub. And then we also have these micro sites which are really some smaller kind of congregate living, but they have individual units like a Conestoga hut that people are actually living in those spaces. So you can see the difference there, 2,400 in Eugene in May, 1,500 beds available across that entire spectrum of housing. Within that, we had about 636 emergency shelter beds available. Now we have about 438 due to COVID. A lot of these nonprofits had to reduce their capacity because of the COVID regulations. Some are starting to grow that capacity back up, but we still have a little bit of time before we're going to see those numbers back to that full capacity. Again, you can see the significant gap in our availability of shelter for these individuals who are on the street. During COVID, there were 2 sites that were established as sort of quasi-sanctioned sites. Washington Jefferson Park, and then a spot out on 13th and Jefferson, 13th and Chambers, were identified as sites that individuals could come and shelter in tents. They would not be moved along, but it really wasn't a site that had a lot of services wrapped around it. They did have restrooms, and there were service providers who were coming in and out of those spaces, but it wasn't what we'll talk about later as a sanctioned site. They are temporary. And the idea is that these individuals are going to have to move out of these spaces as the COVID-19 regulations ease. And we need to find places for them to be in order for them to move out of these spaces that can then be returned to their original use, which in the case of Washington Jefferson Park is a park space. So what's the status of our shelter landscape? 80% of people who are unhoused in Eugene, like I said, are living in places that are not meant for human habitation. So that is the size of the crisis that we're trying to deal with here. Different types of shelter you maybe have heard about. Dawn to Dawn, there's 125 beds currently being operated roughly by St. Vincent de Paul. There's drop-in, some drop-in for vacant beds on a daily basis, but there's minimal case management really happening to and in that space. St. Vincent has a lot of really great wraparound services they do provide, but that space really is a come in, have a safe, sheltered place to sleep. And then the idea is that hopefully we can get folks connected into the service. Another resource we have as a community is a program called Car Camping. This is run by a couple different organizations. There's roughly 85 spots of capacity across the community. Another one is rest stops and microsites. There's a little bit of difference between the two. We had about 80 sites prior to COVID. This past winter, the number of sites was increased. Those are run by nonprofits like Community Supported Shelters, Nightingale Services, Square One Villages, and those really have really great management, and they're sanctioned camping spaces. So there's a lot of services and oversight, and there's resources for individuals in those spaces. And these are the types of sites that we feel like are the quickest path to expanding the capacity that we have for sheltering individuals in the community. So we'll come back and talk about that. Eugene Mission has 24 low barrier beds that they have available on a given night. You can have about a 14-day stay with the Mission, and they have entry point for services and additional service beds that they open up for folks who are going through some of their support services that they offer. Our community is in the process of opening a new, what they call a navigation center. So this is a 75 to 100 low barrier shelter bed space. This really, the intent is to have a ton of wraparound services and to truly be a navigating point where individuals can come in, can get connected to the system, and they can be funneled to the different nonprofits that are providing services. It's not open yet. The county has purchased a site out on River Avenue that they purchased during COVID for a COVID respite site that they are remodeling into what is going to be our community navigation center. Additionally, about a month ago, City Council in Eugene passed a new ordinance that allows certain types of sheltering to be expanded, the number of people. So 200 car camping spots are being attempted to be found, and 300 tent sites across the community, and we can talk a little bit more about that. I see a question here clarifying, homeless was 9,000 in 2020 and now down to 3,245. So 9,000 was the number for the entire year of 2020. 3,000 was the number just for the month of May. So individuals come in and out of our homeless system throughout the year. And if they haven't accessed services within a handful of days, usually a couple months, they get taken out of the system, but they might re-enter it down the road. That they're counted a single time as an individual there. So we look at it both on an annual basis and on a monthly basis, but the most accurate count really for right now what's out on the street is that monthly number of about 3,245. It's a great question. So what are some of the root causes? You know, we're looking at both the crime angle and the homelessness angle, and looking at both of these, some of the root causes for the situation that we're in as far as the criminal activity goes is we have a lack of police resources. You know, a couple years ago when the community did a pretty deep look at our criminal justice system, it was found that our community had not been increasing the number of officers to serve our community per capita as our population was increasing. So many of you probably know there was a community safety initiative that was passed, an ordinance that enabled a payroll tax that a lot of your businesses have been paying since January that was intended to help improve the entire criminal justice system and community justice system from the police department to fire to homeless services, prevention, and court services as well. That investment kind of ranges from 65% originally indicated to invest in the police down to about 5% into homeless or prevention services. And that number is currently being looked at by the city of Eugene as to should those resources still be allocated in that way. As far as homelessness is concerned, we have inadequate mental health resources and support. As a country, we deinstitutionalized mental health services a few decades ago, and we didn't have a way to support those individuals once that deinstitutionalization happened. So what we have is a lot of homeless individuals on the streets with severe mental health issues and not enough money or resources going into solving that problem as a community. The same thing goes for our addiction services. We have a handful of organizations who do really great work in this space, but it's nowhere near the amount, the capacity that it needs to be at, and actually serve the number of individuals who have addiction issues in our community. The federal funding system and the regulations around sheltering is kind of disconnected and disjointed from a local level to the federal level. Federal government says this is what a shelter is and this is what we'll help give you funding for. Locally, we found much quicker, faster, effective options that some don't necessarily align with what the federal government considers a shelter. There's definitely some tension there. And then we are in a housing crisis. We have individuals who, NIMBY, not in my backyard. To be totally frank, there's a lot of folks who say, I really want to see this issue solved. I definitely don't want to see it solved in a location close to me. And as a community, we're just in this place that we have got to figure out how to get over that sentiment. In my personal opinion, we have to make sure these sites are safe and that they're managed and that the businesses and property owners and individuals around those sites are not adversely affected. But we need to be able to find sites across our community to house these vulnerable individuals. There's a lot of codes, labor issues, land issues that are causing this housing crisis. But ultimately, it's one of the core issues that I heard over and over again. In these conversations, I asked what challenges are keeping us from solving this issue. I won't, I can go into detail about more of these if you have specific questions. Regulatory environment, COVID regulations really threw a huge curveball into how a lot of our nonprofits were providing services. There was a court case that was ruled a handful of years ago that essentially said to communities that you have homeless individuals who are habitating on public properties. Communities have to be able to have another spot for them to go safely and legally if they're going to move them from those properties. The most simplest way to kind of explain that. There's also some codes that have loopholes in them where, people think this law is being broken, but for whatever reason, this little piece of it says, no, that actually isn't broken law. And so there's just really complicated laws that are keeping the public unable to understand why the police aren't enforcing specific things. we have a lot of really great efforts, and I want to make sure to reemphasize that happening in our community, but a lot of it is super misaligned or uncoordinated. There's a lack of coordination between the city and county, and kind of an understanding on who is responsible for which piece of this issue and who's going to fund it and how are we going to fund it. They're working on it, but I will say it's not there. It's not perfect. And what I heard from a lot of conversations with individuals close to this space, that they feel like there's this lack of coordination. I know, and I want to make sure to be careful to say, like, there are great city folks working on this, but it's something that they need to be held accountable for. There's multiple layers of groups working on issues, and a lot of times we're kind of duplicating our efforts because we aren't very good at coordinating what is happening in which spaces. So, there's this kind of grassroots level of organization that sort of pops up as people see something they want to do. They don't know that another organization across the community is actually doing that exact thing because we're just not communicating very well. We heard a lot that there was inadequate financial and staffing resources. Our nonprofits are maxed out. They're being asked to manage and support these new camps as they pop up across the community. They have nonprofit, low wages, high turnover, and we need to, as a community, figure out how to help support that system so they can actually do the work that they need to do for our community. Federal funding has a lot of strings attached. I talked a little bit about that. There's I think a gap in the police resources to actually respond to the number of calls that are coming into the community. And businesses have stopped reporting issues because they aren't getting a response. But when our police are trying to have data-driven policing, if they're not actually getting the reports that show that there's crime in those areas, then they're going to stop looking at those spaces for enforcement or proactive policing. So super important for us as a community to continue to use that resource of our police department. There's a lack of political will or disagreement. There's some pretty fundamental disagreements in our community about how this issue should be dealt with. And sometimes that means there's political pressure or public pressure to do things like reduce police funding. And sometimes that means that the bigger risks that need to be taken, some of our leaders just aren't willing to take that risk just yet. And they need really community support to be able to do that. And to be, the simplest way to put it is that we need more places for people to be legally. That means housing and shelter. And that's an issue I think we have to come together as a community to solve. So where do we go from here? I think we can bring back hope to the community. We've put a man on the moon. We've developed a vaccine and a highly contagious virus. In under a year, we can solve this homeless crisis together. But government and nonprofits are not going to be able to do this alone. This is an issue that is bigger than them. It's bigger than what they can manage. And the entire community has got to come together to say, this is something that we are going to solve together. And businesses have to be a part of that conversation. I think that we've wanted to for a while, and frankly, people don't know how to engage with the private community on how to do this. And so that's where the chamber is stepping in to say, okay, we're going to help lead that effort from the business community. So to go back on each of those different areas that I talked about, what's next for our research efforts? We are putting together a survey to send out to businesses to try and gather data about how much financial impact this issue has had on their business. So whether it's crime, vandalism, losing employees, et cetera. We kind of want to understand the scope of how this issue is impacting the business community. We're also working to commission an economic impact or cost analysis study for Lane County so we can really have great data through a third party to really help understand where our money is going currently, how much it's costing us in these areas, so we can use that data to either identify if we have a funding gap and figure out if we need funding in the future, or to see how we can shift those resources differently. We're going to continue to do outreach to other communities. And like I said, we've done an enormous amount of research over the last couple of months. I have several hundreds of pages of notes that we're going to try to boil down and issue a report, just kind of summarizing what it is that we learned, some of the recommendations that we have as a chamber. So communicate and educate. This is something I'm slightly biased towards, but it really feels like this is something that can actually move the needle on this issue, and that is pulling people together, simplifying the information as much as possible, identifying our key metrics that we're trying to move, and then pushing that information back out to the community so they can understand what's currently happening. We're trying to work on a formal communication strategy, working with local partners who do that work on a daily basis. talking about hiring a filmmaker, photographer to kind of document the current state of this crisis, collecting local stories from businesses and homeless individuals. We need to put faces and names with this crisis so people really understand this is not a transactional conversation. These are human beings, and it's really impacting their lives across the community. Continuing informational presentations like this one, if you have a group that you think would be interested in hearing more about this, we'd love to come talk to them. We want to establish a website where we can collect information from all different parts of the community, organize it in one space, present a dashboard with metrics, and encourage that continued reporting of crime. That's something else that we want to make sure we do. Really, we need this to be a collective effort. And we've talked a lot with our partners about, does that live within the government, or does it live outside of the government in a community-oriented collective effort? And that's what we're leaning towards. We need government, we need business, we need nonprofits, we need the faith community, we need the unhoused community, and we need our neighbors at the table, all of us on an equal playing field, addressing this issue together. Innovate and collaborate. Like I said, we're going to continue to push for solutions and find creative ways. We're looking at kind of bringing some community partners together to host a homeless solutions summit where for individuals who want to be a part of this conversation can do so. We are actively working to find sites for individuals to shelter. So we're working with the city and county and with businesses to find private property locations that people might be interested in leasing or renting out for this purpose. We're working on a tour of sanctioned sites that maybe you haven't seen before. We want you to know how they operate. We want you to understand that it looks a lot different than maybe what you're seeing at Washington Jefferson Park. These are clean, they're well managed. And we want people to kind of understand that better, because when the first image that comes in your head is what you're seeing in some of these unsanctioned sites, of course you don't want to see that next to your property. But I think we have to really change the narrative about what you should be expecting. We're going to do in-person tours. If you're interested, please reach out to me. But we're also going to publish this out on Facebook Live so we can try to get access to more people of what these sites really look like. Again, exploring programs in other cities, and then ultimately considering funding options if that's what we decide as a community that we need. Advocate, it's what the chamber does. It's really where the business community can come together around this. We want to mobilize businesses. We're building out a contact list to get communication out to the broader business community. We want to advocate for incentives or policy changes and rules changes that will actually get us to a place where we don't have all these excuses for why we can't do something. We are going to keep pushing on the crime enforcement. We are not trying to criminalize homelessness, and there are clearly issues that don't need the crime enforcement, but there are others that absolutely do. And we cannot, as a community, sort of establish the standard that is not where I think we need to be as a community. So we're going to keep pushing on enforcement of real crimes and not just of being homeless. We're diving into the budgets of both the city and the county to figure out kind of where this funding is going. I talked about the cost analysis. And then ultimately recruiting community-oriented, business-friendly candidates to run for elected office. The chamber's done that forever. We want to keep continuing to do that. And issues like this, I feel like it's important to make sure that we're thinking big picture down the road as well. I will say, as far as our elected officials are concerned, they are in no more of a position necessarily than we are to have the solutions and to have a silver bullet for how we're going to solve this problem. They, as much as you and I, need ideas. They need people coming to the table to say, here's something that we could do. Then we need to hold them accountable for actually doing those things. But a lot of times they're sitting there just like you and I saying, we want to solve this. We know it's a problem. We're trying to figure out the best way to do it. So we need to hold those individuals accountable, but then we also know we need to work with them to help provide them the resources and the information and the solutions that they need as well. So how can you help? Join the coalition and share this information. You can email me if you want to get on our communication list. Eventually we'll have a website kind of stood up where you can kind of join the initiative. Share this webinar. We're going to push the business survey out and the research report hopefully in the next month. So please feel free to digest and share that information. Take that business impact survey and then advocate for solutions. Consider joining our group to help find shelters for individuals. I think as a business community and business leaders, we know what it's like to identify a problem and then create a path to solving it. And this is a problem that has a number attached to it that we can sit down and say, we need to find 500 sites across this community to shelter individuals so they have safe places to be. Then we can have the conversation about where the folks who don't want to move into those sites are going to go. And then show up at city council if you're willing and able to either write them or show up. We want to engage you in that conversation. They need to hear from us. They need to hear about our experiences. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to open it up for questions.
So Brittany, I can read off the list of questions if that works for you.
Sure.
So this one came back from earlier on in your slide. It's please clarify the dollar value this new homeless tax is generating. How much to the EPD, fire services, etc.?
Yeah, good question. So I have to admit, I need the, I have to pull up the numbers to get it right in front of me. What I know is that they were hoping to generate about $28 million. They're not generating that much just yet since the tax just started. And there's still a lot of businesses who don't even know to be paying into this yet. 65% of that number was originally going to be allocated to the police department. There were dollars going to fire, going to homeless services, going to prevention services, and to the court system as well. I'll try to, as I'm answering other questions, pull up that document that we have that I can share.
Perfect. This one's about the TAC report. And if you want to go into a little bit of what that was, it says, how does a chamber executed report expand on the existing TAC report? And what's the status of execution on recommendations in the TAC report?
Yeah, great question. So the TAC report was a report that was commissioned by the city and county about 3 years ago now from an organization that does this type of work across the country. Really, the original kind of impetus for this was for them to help us determine, do we have a need for a public shelter? And what they did is they came in and they took a pretty big picture, systematic look at our homeless network and how we were serving homeless individuals. And they focused on single unhoused adults in their research, which of course does not really tell the entire story of our unhoused population. We have couples, we have families, we have children who are homeless on the streets. And they came up with 10 recommendations. They did not provide an implementation plan. They just had 10 recommendations of how we as a community could improve our system in order to better serve the homeless population and hopefully eventually reduce that number. There are a couple shortcomings of that report. One is that they were still using our point in time count numbers, which we knew were significantly underreported. So the sheer scope of the issue is just bigger than what they even reported on. The second, like I mentioned, was that it was just looking at single unhoused adults. And the third is that it was just a report. It was just like, here's 10 things that you could do. And we as a community have to figure out, how do we implement this? And we have. There's been concerted effort, the city and county, to move this forward. The city and county hired a joint homeless strategist for figuring out how to implement the TAC report specifically. She's done a lot of work over this last year. COVID set everybody back. And to be frank, it really sidelined some of the initiatives and some of the work that they were doing in that space. The TAC report, so what the Chamber's report is, really is it's more a sort of state of our current kind of homeless situation from the perspective of the individuals who are working in this space and identifying why things aren't working, and less of a like in-depth, here's the system, kind of like the TAC report is. The TAC report saying you need to improve coordination between service providers, but then it goes into detail to say the data collection system that you need to use needs to be updated so it's easier for these nonprofits to use, things like that. So it'll complement and include recommendations from the TAC report so the broader community can kind of know the TAC report is one report of several that have been issued and plans within our community. We need to get those all in one place, and I agree to one specific plan for how we're going to deal with this.
The next question is, do we have any idea how much money it would take to either solve or significantly reduce the problem of homelessness in our community?
Good question. I'm hoping that an economic impact analysis will at least get us closer to understanding how we might calculate that number. I think the problem is we're not going to, I don't think pouring a bunch of money into the problem is what's needed. I think that there's some organization and systematic changes that have to be made, because we could keep pouring money into it, but if the system is still, dysfunctional at some level, we're never going to get there. I will say that when it comes to mental health services and our housing crisis, we're not going to build our way out of homelessness, but we have got to figure out a way to continue to build more housing in this community that is affordable for individuals who right now are either at risk of homelessness or are literally homeless on the street. So there is some funding that needs to go into that, and I'm hoping that we can have some sort of number to send out and recommend to the community with some more research.
This next question is chamber specific. How does the Eugene Chamber plan to work with other chambers in Lane County to move solutions forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I saw Heather ask that. Right now, we're trying to get our bearings kind of straight for our own organization, but you're right. This is a community-wide, county-wide issue, and other chambers across the county could be great resources for us to kind of bring into the conversation. We have good relationships with a lot of the other executive directors from chambers across the county, and we'll work to reach out to them. And I think even having that question is a good prompt for me to do that.
How often does the city, county, and state review past solutions? Some solutions have results less than desired or hinder future solutions. So how often are they reviewing those?
Great question. I think not often enough. I think as a community, we sort of go through these phases where it feels like we get to a point where we're like, we don't have a plan. So we bring a bunch of people together and we start from scratch to develop a plan, when in reality, a lot of these solutions are already lined out for us. We just have to figure out how to execute them better. And so the TAC report is a really good example. If you actually go back into the late 90s, there was a county report that identified a handful of the same things that the TAC report done in 2018 had already identified. And so I think as a community, we need to be looking at the things that we're putting in place already and not start from scratch. And really, we might have all the ingredients for what our strategic plan for this area could be already in existence in the community. It just needs to be put into how we're going to actually implement it and execute on it, and then communicate it out to the broader community.
Has it ever been considered to offer property owners significant tax reduction incentives to provide shelter locations on their property?
Yes, so this is an area that we've been exploring over the last couple months as we're trying to recruit property owners. The county has a property abatement program where if you offer your space to government or nonprofit entity to be used for this purpose, you can reduce your property taxes if that savings is kind of passed along to the leasee of your property. This is something that we're trying to highly encourage the city and county to emphasize in these conversations, because the reality is if we need help and businesses have something to give, like, let's incentivize more businesses to come to the table. We need to pay our nonprofit service providers adequate funds for them to execute on these services, just as we need to think about what do we need to lease these properties as well. So there is a property abatement program, or property tax abatement program, and happy to talk to any of you more about that if you're interested, or if you have a property that are like, hey, I might consider it, even if it's as much as one spot. We have nonprofits who have incredible programs that they've put together. Carry It Forward is one of them I saw Heather mention, where they can help you locate someone on your property, vet to make sure that they're the right fit, that it'll be a safe fit for you. A lot of times those individuals living on these properties actually have this sense of ownership of that space, of the, the parking lot or the, the property that you are leasing to them. And they want to keep it nice and protected too. So I feel like there's opportunities for us to actually kind of think differently about how we address this as a community. But the reality is, like, we need those spots if we want to try to move unsanctioned camping off of our commercial, industrial, and neighborhood streets.
This next question is about mental health specifically. With so many individuals suffering from significant and likely permanent mental health issues, meaning needed permanent services and housing, is there any current project or solution for those specific individuals?
sorry, I'm kind of reading this one again. So many individuals suffering. Yes, there is. So I mentioned a specific type of housing that we're pursuing in our community. It's called permanent supportive housing. And this housing really is built and intended as a permanent residence for someone. And it's kind of known and acknowledged that some of these individuals are not going to move on from this type of housing into some other type of housing. There are individuals in our community who are not mentally stable or healthy enough to live on their own without supportive services around them. Homes for Good is kind of the county designated entity that is building this permanent supportive housing across the community. And they have incredibly innovative and resourceful programs that they've implemented. There's a relatively new property out on Martin Luther King Boulevard that they opened with 50 spots that has really great wraparound services and supportive services for those individuals. So we do have some programs like that in our community. We just don't have enough. And I think that's really what, we've learned over and over again in these conversations and research, is that we kind of know what we need to do. It's just, how do we scale it up as a community to actually address the size of the problem that we have here? And how do we make sure that instead of duplicating a bunch of different efforts across nonprofits and reducing the amount of funds that they have to do any of it, that we start to build partnerships and coalition and collectively address these things so we can just be more efficient with the resources that we do have.
We have just a couple more minutes technically scheduled out, but this is the end of our questions. If anybody has some burning questions they might have hesitated to ask, you're more than welcome to continue, put them in the chat. Thank you. We have one more. In your research, have you found that there are conditions specific to the Eugene metro area that make the problems we see associated with homelessness worse than in other similarly sized cities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's sort of a perfect storm of issues that I found, and I'm sure we haven't really uncovered all of them. I don't know if I mentioned this in this presentation. I did a very similar one earlier this morning, but a lot of times as a community, we look at Eugene and Springfield, and a lot of people say, well, Springfield doesn't have this issue. So what is Eugene doing wrong? The reality is Eugene's the biggest community in our county. We have a lot of the resources here because that's where the nonprofits have located. And we have different cultures in our community. The city of Springfield has a jail. Everybody knows that. That's a resource that their community has to enforce some of the crimes that are happening on the streets in a way that is different than the way Eugene does. We hear from service providers who are located in both Eugene and Springfield that one of the big differences is that if you pick up the phone and call the cops for theft or robbery or something happening, you're going to get a police to respond a lot faster in Springfield than Eugene. I mentioned before, Eugene's the amount of officers to serve our community based on our size is inadequate. We had a business owner just last week that called me and had gotten into a situation near his business where a homeless individual had, and he knew because he'd been living in this RV outside of his business, shot a gun through his window, and the bullet went in through his back window, shattered it, and into the back of his truck. And he called the cops to report that crime. And the cops didn't show up for about an hour and a half. So he calls me, tells me that story. I immediately get on the phone with Chief Skinner and I'm like, what the heck's happening? How is this even possible? Chief Skinner goes back, looks at the call logs, and he's able to help us understand exactly what happened in that call that caused the police to make a decision to not send somebody immediately. The first was that business owner went back to his business and kind of got himself out of the scene of the crime, out of the situation that was unsafe, which is exactly the right thing to do. I definitely don't want the takeaway to be don't leave the scene of the crime. And so that automatically put him at a certain level of of crisis as you're a 911 call operator listening to the call. There was a handful of other variables, and the reality was at that exact moment that individual called 911 on Wednesday at 9:30 p.m., there were 33 other calls in the queue for the police or for the 911 dispatcher at that moment. And so they have to make decisions about, with 8 officers on duty, how are they going to get to 33 calls? And that's just where we're at right now. I think that there is, as a community, this larger conversation about defunding the police, but also about systematic racism that absolutely has to be addressed. And I fully support looking into the policies and procedures of our police department, of our enforcement departments, to make sure that we're addressing those systematic issues. But we also need to recognize that the sheer amount of crime that is happening cannot all be funneled into a community safety officer or into a cahoots. There is real crime happening that we need police officers to respond to. And that's what we want to be looking at, is the data and making sure that we're doing both things. We're addressing the systematic racism, we're addressing the way that we're responding to calls to make sure that we're actually responding with the right people and the right resources at the right time, but that the calls that really need a police response are also getting that police response. And so, Michael, you asked, I went on a long tangent. You asked about how our community is a little bit different. I think the police, the size of our police department is one. The nature of our community, we have an incredibly giving and compassionate community, and I don't think that's a bad thing. But I think that historically it has been a place that has attracted individuals to this community. We also have, as a state, we passed a measure that decriminalized small amounts of drugs that we have heard from our police department has created some issues where, we aren't seeing the funds just yet from that measure to put back into actually deterring these crimes, but we're not able to arrest somebody for having heroin on them in certain levels. So there's kind of timing issues when those types of things happen. I could go on and on. It's a perfect storm of things like that I think have put us in this situation. And the reality is the West Coast is absolutely in a crisis, and we are not alone. Yes, we have this issue, but so does Medford, and so does Roseburg, and so does Bend, and so does Portland, and you see it all the way up and down the West Coast. So it's easy to sort of feel like we're in it and we have it the worst, but the reality is it's really bad everywhere, and we all have to kind of figure out how to solve this together.
We just have time for just a few more questions. This person writes, different organizations have different philosophies about, quote unquote, where to start. That could be housing, addiction, mental health. What are our resources for the latter two starting points, which are addiction and mental health?
Yeah, so there's a couple organizations in the community who really are known for this. It's what they exist for. But they, just like others, are kind of at a funding deficit, if you will, for the amount of service that they need to be providing. There are different philosophies. Our community has adopted a housing first philosophy. Housing first does not mean we just put everybody in shelter and then hope for the best. It means that we put people in shelter and we provide wraparound services to those individuals to actually get them into a more stable place. What we have not done as a community is, and again, it's at no fault of the nonprofits, is provide the amount of wraparound services that those individuals need to actually get well. But then it comes back to housing too, is that I've talked to a lot of providers who say, okay, we got wraparound services. I got the folks out on the street doing community outreach. We're getting people into our programs. I have nowhere to put them. I do not have a home, an apartment, an affordable place for them to rent to actually get them up off the street. So we have to simultaneously address our housing shortage along with our mental health and substance abuse crises and our crime, right? It can't be one or the other. It has to sort of be moving along at the same pace.
Wonderful. Well, that's all of our questions for today, and looks like we're right on time to wrap up.
All right.
And to answer a previous question, yes, we will make the slide deck available. We'll send out this meeting to all the attendees as a recording.
Yeah, I really appreciate everybody's support here, and we want to make sure that you're connected to this issue if you want to be. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have further questions. If you kind of want to digest this, please do. I should also say the data is changing every day. We know that this is not a static system. So, we might find something new that we need to share, or a data point that's changed. So I appreciate if there's any kind of attention being paid to this, that we maybe got something wrong, please feel free to point that out, because we want to make sure we get it right. We really appreciate you guys. And I really do believe that we can do hard things and we can do this together. It's just going to take some organization and communicating and making sure that we don't just have a couple people at the table trying to solve this, but we're all sort of coming together and saying, this is our community and this is an issue we're all going to address together. So thank you for being here. And I hope you guys have a great afternoon.